This is Gary 2.0, the computer age. So imagine not that these historians were meeting in 1993. By the way, it's interesting, 1993, the backdrop of that is a group of historians had recently met to complain to the University Press of Florida that they weren't publishing enough in Florida history. If you look at where most of those books had been published in the late 80s, they were being published at University of Alabama, University of Georgia. And it was only with the coming of George Bedell and then Meredith that the press focused on Florida. So that's another story. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for the University Press of Florida. So I often think about those historians who met in 1993. But let's have an imaginary meeting, and this is not that imaginary. Imagine that in 1945, the historians of Florida had met to plan a similar volume. First of all, they would probably all agree that one of the great challenges of Florida is what to do about all this water. How do we get rid of the water? Not how do we, but what would they, if each of them wrote down what is the most fantastic prediction you could make about Florida, could you possibly beat these? That Floridian, and here's the point here. When's the last time you've seen an image of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, in a history talk? In Florida, in modern Florida, Isaiah's prophecies came true. Hot was made cold, wet became dry, and the crooked bent straight. And to appreciate the distance from VJ Day, 1945, to 1993 and 2013, imagine these prophecies in 1994. That Floridians would someday endure an August evening without sweating or swatting. And again, the impact of air conditioning and DDT. That kind of looks like David Colburn, doesn't it, as a kind of a provost firing someone there. That someday motorists could travel nonstop between Miami and New York. That someday the New York Yankees might be playing baseball, professional baseball, inside an air-conditioned dome in St. Petersburg. How unlikely is that? That sun-drenched Florida would someday claim 2 professional ice hockey franchises. Ice hockey in Florida, that makes no sense. That sleepy Brevard County, which in 1945 had a population of about 17,000 inhabitants, would one day become the rocket capital of the free world. By the way, it happened in 1949. Almost to the day, the Florida legislature outlawed the open range. So think about this. In Florida, the space age ends when the frontier. The space age begins when the frontier ends in Florida. That Florida, this is one of my favorite clippings of all time. In 1951, the Democratic legislature discovered that the chaplain was a closet Republican and what to do about this. But that one day, Florida, a Democratic bastion of the solid South, would become red state Republican. And that had not even happened in 1993. Within 6 years, I think, after 1993, the Republicans take over the legislature and then later the governorship. That the Seminoles, the most impoverished group in 1945 Florida, would become the wealthiest group. And that upstate New York, or that upstate Florida, will rival and surpass New York someday. And that's probably going to happen sometime in the next 3 or 4 months. That a retired accountant from Kokomo or an auto worker from Kalamazoo will walk through and get a free citrus juice, and the banners will come down, and the New York Post headline will read, "Empire State to Sunshine State, drop dead." Well, in 1844, Ralph Waldo Emerson walked into a New England newspaper office, and the first telegram laid along the Atlantic coast had only been received a few moments earlier. It heralded the first communications revolution. Isn't it amazing, the great transcendentalist said to this old Maine editor. He said, now Maine can talk to Florida. And the elderly editor replied, yes, but has Maine anything to say to Florida? And in fact, in 2013, Maine and the rest of the world have a lot to say to Florida. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now is what has happened since we wrote that essay in 1993. This is all new material for the book. And the Sunshine State has become irresistible to talk shows, to demographic scholars. In some ways, it's every man's metaphor today, Florida in 2013. To oceanographers, kind of Florida is the endangered osprey in the mine shaft. To political wonks, the I-4 corridor is kind of the new runestone. To crime novelists, Florida is the capital of 21st century noir. To internet junkies, Florida is the weirdest place in the world where Nostradamus' prophecies come true on fark.com. The most asked question I get from journalists, why is Florida so weird? Seriously, I bet once a week I'll get a telephone call. I tell them, call David Colburn. The Sunshine State is so complex today. It's really difficult to get a handle on it. Journalists often ask just where does Florida belong? And I always like this idea that Florida, and this was true from earliest Florida, Florida is both the southernmost state and it's also the capital of the Caribbean in a lot of ways. And it depends in Florida where you're standing. If you're in St. Augustine, this seems much more like a southern state, or if you're in Jacksonville or Tallahassee. But if you're in Miami or Key West, it's a very different place. You can walk to the Georgia border from Tallahassee in one day. It's 900 miles from Key West to Pensacola, to put this in perspective. To understand Florida in the last 50 years, you really needed a new dictionary, a new lexicon to understand these paradigm shifts that transform the place. Think of the very words we've used this 2 days. Climate control, space age, retirement community, edge city, boomburg, timeshare condominium, I-4 corridor. I've written a lot about the Florida dream. And it's an interesting concept. I mean, think about probably the first Florida dream is in the late 19th century. I mean, we're looking at the Ponce de Leon. That is the Florida dream. The idea that you no longer have to travel to Malaga or Portofino or Nice. You can come to St. Augustine and spend the winter at the Ponce de Leon or the Alcazar or the Tampa Bay Hotel. And that's the new Florida dream. Florida is the new Mediterranean. And that was for the wealthy, obviously. And in the 1920s, the idea was it's now a dream for the middle class with your Model T or Model A coming down Dixie Highway. The middle classes can enjoy Florida. And the dream of the orange groves and everything. And that dream dashed in 1926. And then in the ashes of World War II come this new Florida dream. This is the most powerful dream of all. It's a Florida for every American. That you can buy. Florida is California on the cheap. You can buy an inexpensive ranch style here. And there's a premise in this Florida dream that there's something special about a place with palm trees and warm winters. But it's also the promise of rejuvenation and restoration and a better February. And that's the Florida dream. And that may have died in 2006 or 2008. And I mean, one of the interesting questions is, what is the new Florida dream going to look like? And we're not having a lot of conversations about that. And still, going back to 1993, Florida had a lot of problems in 1993. And I wrote, and still they came. And for the next 12 years, I was always intrigued. This is amazing. If you think about it, since World War II, almost unabated, except for a few blimps, 1,000 people arrived every day in Florida. I mean, every day, 1,000 newcomers. The population is a demographics dream state to try to figure this out. What's going to derail this? If in 2000, in not even 4 hurricanes, not the 2000 election, hanging chads there, not 4 hurricanes in 2004. I remember I was finishing Land of Sunshine in 2004, and 2 months after 2 hurricanes had hit Pensacola Bay, land values were increasing. I'm thinking, wow, nothing is going to derail this Florida boom. And by 2005, the conversation seemed to be, if New Mexico has an official question in New Mexico, is red or green. In Florida, the official question should have been in 2005, how much has my house appreciated since last week? I mean, everyone was talking about how land values, and still they came. And in April 2006, Florida Trend published a cover story. They analyzed a day in Florida. And they said, actually, not 1,000 people were no longer coming to Florida. In 2006, it was 1,912 people were coming to Florida every day, but 1,000 were leaving every day. And no one ever seemed to have the conversation or the question, what's going to happen when 1,000 people stop coming? And welcome to Florida 2013. We found out people aren't buying newspaper ads, they're not buying sod, they're not paying taxes, and I'm not advocating 1,000, but thus officially began the Great Recession. I don't think we've got a better name for it yet. About the era of bad feelings, that might be a possibility there. 2 stories illustrate this. In 1975, John Nordheimer was writing for New York Times, and he said, you want to understand Florida? He said, how's this for a vantage point? I think he's outside Gainesville, actually, on the interstate. And it's Thanksgiving weekend. He said, you don't have to be a demographer to figure out, for every car headed north, there's about 10 moving vans heading south. It's Thanksgiving weekend. And this is the rush to Florida. In 2007, Atlas Van Line said, for the first time in its history, more people were moving out of Florida than in. I don't think we were ever losing people, principally because of immigration, but that was a glaring demographic punctuation mark there. Shortly after the Great Malaise, George Packer of New Yorker magazine visited me, and he said, I need a metaphor to understand Florida. And I said, well, in some ways, Florida worked fine as long as 1,000 people came every day. People paid their taxes, they bought sod, and it's much like a Ponzi scheme. As long as newcomers came, Florida was fine. And he said, I've got my metaphor. And he wrote his story called The Ponzi State. And I got about a dozen calls from various chambers of commerce in Florida saying, thanks for helping boost Florida. We really appreciate the efforts. And we'll communicate this with our legislators and your president. Well, Floridians, in the last 5 years, we've had to learn a new lexicon to understand the Great Recession. How many of you knew the meaning of these 5 years ago? Underwater, upside down, toxic mortgages, short sales, robo-signings, collateralized debt obligations, zombie homes, and flipping. Journalists have lacerated the state. Here's Michael Grunwald, a Time magazine essay, Is Florida the Sunshine State? He writes, a New York Times writer wrote, welcome to the American dream in high reverse. I mean, that's about as stunning and stinging an epitaph for Florida that you can imagine. The American dream in high reverse. Michael Grunwald asked an interesting question. He said, We're first in the nation in mortgage fraud, second in foreclosures, last in high school graduation rates. The question is, when will Florida grow up? And it's an interesting question that's been asked before. And I return to World War II. In 1943, how many of you know the novelist Philip Wiley? I don't think anyone's read Philip Wiley in about 40 years. He was a big writer in the 40s and 50s, and he wrote a front page story in the Miami Herald in 1943, which I think is one of the most prophetic and profound essays I've ever read. He hated people who called Miami a garish, third-rate city. He writes, he dreamed, rather, that Florida would be more than a tropical Coney Island. He hectored and pleaded, quote, "At the end of the war, there will be two courses open to Florida. We can seize the gigantic opportunities at hand and develop this unique region into a new heart of the new world, or we can go on being a tropical Coney Island." He desperately wanted a better Florida. He said, "We haven't asked people to live here. We've asked them to play here. And we've asked them to visit here." Some questions as in conclusion, I think we need to ask. Will Florida become a model showing the nation how to manage growth, restore ecosystems, preserve water, balance generations of diverse residents into a common cause? And that's a tough climb. Will the challenge of global warming simply overwhelm a state with 1,200 miles of coastline, or will the crisis serve as a rallying cry? Should Florida possibly maintain the pell-mell growth that added 16 million residents between 1945 and 2005? Will baby boomers choose to retire in Florida in the numbers their parents did, or will they prefer new destinations with less sunshine but more amenities? Will boomers seek the structured lifestyle of Sun City or the villages, or will they prefer to rock on in their individual ways? I'm not going to move to Florida anymore. I remember it fondly as a child with its pristine lakes and beautiful coastlines. It's simply now too crowded, too polluted. We've got some great challenges ahead, and I really appreciate you coming and spending hours here. Thank you.
Questions from the audience? Please use the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
I'm going to give you my own personal projection for the future of Florida. As a young boy, I moved from Philadelphia, South Philly, to Harlem, and Mormino, Philly. And I went to California in 1957. Lived in the Bay Area. And we used to go hunting up in Napa before they discovered wine. Used to make better wine in New York State one time. Why I'm telling this now, that was California in the 1950s. I'm using a parallel, if I can, for a second. I was in California about 2 months ago. There's 35 million people in California right now. There's 35 million people in all of Canada. Just visualize that. My daughter built a new home in Palo Alto. She lives in a section where there's moors, and you go 2 blocks over, there's have moors. You leave Palo Alto, and you can go right to slums real fast. So California has reached the pinnacle of no return. It's just overwhelmed itself. Now, I bought a house here in Florida roughly 25 years ago in the St. Johns River, passing through. I never was in northern Florida my whole life. I used to fly down to Miami. I came up here to visit a Churchill relative in Jacksonville and discovered St. Johns River. Wow, I couldn't believe something like that existed in the East Coast of America. 3 weeks later, we come back, we bought a house, we didn't even know what it looked like, my wife and I just wanted to come. A little bungalow, fell in love with Florida. I won't give you the long tale, but 13 years ago we moved downtown because St. Augustine was such a, I didn't know places that existed like St. Augustine. And yet, what the St. Johns County had what, roughly 75, 80,000 people 25 years ago? It's probably over 200,000 now, approaching that. What kills it all? Simple, overpopulation. Now you can take it any way you want. I know we all want that dream of more and more people coming because it makes it sound important and superior, but you reach a tipping point rather rapidly. And I think Florida is probably right at that cusp right now. You know, of course, in 20, 25 years, we will be California. There'll be 35 million people here, and it won't be what it looks like now. And that's my thoughts on it.
I want to challenge the premise that I just heard a little bit ago. Why should Florida, in the time of globalization, have a character as a state? Admittedly, I come from a state that's schizophrenic. North, South, North and South Louisiana are very different places. But why should any state have a, quote, character, unquote? What do you mean by that? Or an identity that somehow sets it apart in an age when supposedly we're all citizens of the world now. And maybe what Florida is doing is actually showing us, it's been suggested, showing us what the future really will be. And that question is not the right question to be asked at all.
No, that's excellent question, and what does our future hold in a highly mobile society like ours? How do we define ourselves today by the life we live? And can we extract from that some sense of what it means to be a Floridian? I think not, quite frankly. And maybe the same is true of my home state where I grew up, Rhode Island. Well, I do think Rhode Islanders have a sense of who they are. They've got a sense of their past, the role of Roger Williams, etc. We in Florida have almost, this conference I think reveals, others like it do, that we in Florida have no sense of our rich Spanish past, the rich cultural traditions that intersected in Florida over the course of time, and how that defines us or shapes us today. So we're missing something there, but you're probably right. In a state where we've got the mobility that we see, where as many people move in as almost move out, and as many people come in for short stints, seniors come in for 6 months and a day to qualify for the tax breaks in Florida. But where's their identity? It's not in our state. Where's the identity of the immigrants who locate in Florida for freedom, for a place to educate their children, for a place to put their money where it'll be secure over time, but they keep going back home because there's family and other things that draw them. So I don't have the answer to your question other than it's incredibly complicated, and I think the future is one probably without a mythic identity that will unify us.
I wanted to cast the net a little bit wider on the thoughts of Florida today and some other states that are like it. We've mentioned several times here today that within the next few months, Florida will become the third most populous state, not the fourth most populous state. And that makes in numerical order California, Texas, and Florida together, which compose around 27 to 28% of the U.S. population in those three states. All of them are in the South. All of them are on some saltwater body, Pacific Ocean, Gulf, and the Gulf and the Atlantic for Florida. And all of them are, to go back to the beginning of this program, all are part of the Spanish Empire in their past. And I think as we look to this, perhaps out of those three at the moment, Texas has the most similar identity, but that just be maybe my misinformation on how Texas feels about itself. I don't know that we would say that California has a singular identity. And I think, you know, that as we've talked here at the past few presentations, it's hard to have an identity when you feel like you're in transition, because your identity itself is in transition. And I think we need to look to those other states that are like us, that are composing such a huge portion of the nation's population right now, to see where the similarities are there and the similarities of the trends.
Someone had mentioned earlier, I mean, this is the third Spanish period. I mean, think about it. I mean, if you wanted to coin a historic and, I suppose, ethnic, racial identity, it is extraordinary period we're witnessing, and much of it very recent.
I wanted to cast the net a little smaller. Since I don't have any idea what to do about Florida, I really have questions about my own little city of St. Augustine. Because since I've lived here 20 years, we went from a town that cared about history to a town that cares about pirates and ghost tours. And right and left, I mean, they're just ripping down historic buildings. And I think that the vision of who we are, even as St. Augustinians, really is in jeopardy. I mean, are we now just a big concert venue for people to come in, reap the, I'm not really sure what we're trying to become. I see the desperation of the economy. But again, why are we throwing away history? We still don't have any kind of viable civil rights museum. We don't have, any of the stuff that's really us. What we have are, like I said, sort of an amusement park of ghost tours and pirates. So do you have any theories of what we can do as St. Augustinians to try to have a better vision of maybe what's more sustainable? How can we grow up, as you said?
Mormino looks at me and says, please answer this one. I think St. Augustine is growing up. I wrote about it, the civil rights past, some 30 years ago. It does seem to me that St. Augustine has always been about making money. And that's been the prime driver. How do we make money out of this place and make it work for us? And other things got in the way over time. But I think today, it seems to me St. Augustine is trying to come to terms with its heritage, including its racial heritage. And it seems to me that the city, by the partnership it's established with the University of Florida and with Flagler, it's rebuilding the past so that it's more than about pirates and ghost stories. So I'm reasonably sanguine about St. Augustine and the direction it's headed. And I think if you asked me that 10 or 15 years ago, I wouldn't have said that.
Again, perspective. What other city in Florida, St. Augustine's what, 15,000 people today? What other city in Florida would turn out hundreds of people to listen to historians talking about St. Augustine and Florida history? If this conference had been held in Tampa, you would have had a few dozen people at most. So I must admit, I've always been overwhelmed by the sensitivity and interest of St. Augustinians in their history. I hate ghost tours. I don't know how to combat it, but boy, it seems to me you're doing a lot of things right here. And with a great deal to lose. I mean, here's a city where if it tripled in size, would be imperiled, I think. So, I mean, keep up the fight, but keep in mind, at least from my perspective, I'm pretty impressed with your appreciation of the past here.
Well, Mary actually started with what I had hoped to say, that being in St. Augustine for a long time, and I've been here working on and off for about 40 years, it's easy to see the things that you don't particularly enjoy that have developed, and it sometimes makes it harder to see the things that really have. The ghost tours and a lot of the more touristic approaches to history are really, I think, just a layer on top of the good things that have been preserved, why people still come to St. Augustine for history. And the fact that, as Gary said, we've had people here for the last 2 days on gorgeous days, and not just the academics, it's the people of St. Augustine. And at historical society events and research society events, they're always packed. And by comparison, in Gainesville, you would never get really a crowd of this size at these sorts of events. St. Augustine's the only place in the country with an archaeological ordinance that has some financial teeth to it. And so I think there is a lot that's sometimes hard to appreciate when you see the more visible parts of the development. So, well, thank you, Gary, for saying that too.
What I got up to say basically was that I've been told that Florida is a microcosm of the United States. We don't have the winters, we don't have the ice, we don't have the mountains, but we pretty much have everything else in terms of the diversity of the people and their feelings, and certainly politically and culturally and many other things. But that's sort of, and I sort of feel that, especially if I travel to different parts of the states. Each part is very, very different. I mean, St. Augustine's different from Jacksonville. You've got the Hastings. It's a rural community. You go to Orlando and it's Disneyland and everything else down there. And you go to Miami and all of the culture. But you sort of see a lot of diversity within the state that you would find elsewhere in the United States, but it's kind of compact within our small state. The other thing I just wanted to mention, as someone who grew up in St. Augustine and returned 9 years ago, one of what could be a problem with trying to deal with the history and everything else, and I think it's been coming together more recently, is that you've got private ownership of things, you've got city ownership of things, state, federal, and now the University of Florida, thank goodness, has come in and is working to try and bring a lot of this together. But a number of years ago, my father and Senator Park's father went to Jamestown prior to the 400th anniversary to see what did they do and what can we do here. Well, the difference is Jamestown is a private foundation. St. Augustine was a lot of commercial interest, and that's a big, big difference. And I think that's probably why there's been so many difficulties really come to grips with St. Augustine. But it's great to know how much history is coming out and continues to come out about the city and about the state. Thank you.
Comment about Jamestown and everything else. Certainly that area, the historic Triangle of Virginia, is having that same problem with commercialization and everything else. I mean, you know, the main attraction used to be Colonial Williamsburg. You know, Colonial Williamsburg has been way overtaken by Water Country USA and outlet malls and Busch Gardens, the old country. And you know, they too are struggling. You know, that is an area that is, you know, completely dependent on historic tourism, and increasingly that historic tourism is taking back seat towards that other stuff. And they are, you know, so St. Augustine is not alone in dealing with those issues.
Dr. Colburn, when you had the first slide and you were going through a list of things, and you got to the point of diversity where you said something about Hispanics and white people and whether they were seniors and African American, and I thought you said something about that the policies were being focused more on the Hispanics than the African Americans. But you didn't go into any detail, and I just tried to picture how a government would work its policies to affect or not affect people by their ethnicity as opposed to their economic circumstances. Could you say more about that?
Well, the big issue really came in the 60s when the Cubans began to migrate into the United States, fleeing Fidel Castro and the communist regime he imposed on Cuba. It was at the same time that the nation was coming to terms with its own racial past, and Florida was coming to terms with its. And Black Floridians were expecting that the state would begin to provide some sort of relief for what they had experienced in their past in the state of Florida. All of that was pushed aside as the nation and the state dealt with this huge flood of Cuban immigrants and refugees. And the federal government provided significant appropriation dollars to assist in the Cuban settlement, despite the fact that many of the Cubans who came were particularly well-off and well-educated and did quite well, thank you, even without the federal support, but they had the federal support to assist them. The African-American population in Florida got none of that. The other thing that caused great discontent in the black community was that if you look at our society, we in all its permutations, with the exception of the African-American community, we pass property and wealth along to one another. It gives our children, grandchildren, a real advantage in life. Black Americans and Black Floridians in particular have almost nothing to pass along to their children. And then to see the government interceding on behalf of Cubans and ignoring their plight was something that was particularly distressing. I could talk more about the Hispanic population support provided there, but I think you get the drift.
Let me just follow up on that because I had a personal experience with it when I was teaching at FAU. I had been writing about race relations in Miami. Is that still working?
That's good.
For some time, and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission came to Miami in somewhere in about 1992 or 3, and I got subpoenaed to testify, give my testimony to the commission about the state of race relations in Miami. Now, it wasn't bad to be subpoenaed. I was happy to go and serve my government, and I knew something about this subject. But, and I made a 5-page prepared statement about the state of racial relations, which I didn't feel were very good. There was just, although a number of other people said, oh, things are doing great here in Miami, everyone's getting along so well. I said, well, you know what? It's not going to take very much to touch off another incident that will turn very nasty. And there was a couple of people on the panel who were from anti-immigrant groups, and they were making their case. And so I brought up this point David just made about the investment that the federal government made in Cuban Americans as the immigrants as they came from Cuba. Something like $3 billion were invested in various kinds of resettlement. They had multiple training programs at the University of Miami to retrain all the professionals, doctors, engineers, dentists, lawyers, get them retrained and certified to practice their professions in the U.S. They had other educational programs, they had employment programs, housing programs, the whole works. And in response to that guy who was defending that, and I should point out that the black community turned out in big numbers for this event. They were sitting in a room like this, and the commission was up on a dais, and I was facing them. And I said, if the federal government had put $3 billion into the Miami black community, things would look a lot different. Big cheer, whatever. So I felt pretty good about that.
I just want to say, I'm Margaret Pope, and I've been a journalist for 42 years, retiring last year. And this year, the city of St. Augustine is launching a vision process. I think this conference is perfectly timed to the city's visioning process that's going to begin. They had an introductory meeting last week. You can go on staugustine.com and read about it. That's a plug for my former newspaper. But the important thing about it is that it will bring people together, and it's a public visioning process. And already people are kind of concerned, well, too much is going to be in the sunshine, government in the sunshine. But I think it's a wonderful opportunity for the kinds of comments that were made about where are we going, and I'm an optimist. I believe that when we have these kinds of structured programs, things do happen. I was on the trip in '93 to Charleston that began the visioning process back then, My mother was on the trip that Nell referenced to Williamsburg and Jamestown in the 1950s to help launch the 400th and what do we want to be. So I think all these things we've heard today are the kind of things that you should be at those meetings, because I'm going to be there, and I'm not necessarily going to be writing about it, I'm going to be talking about it. Thank you.
My name is Consuelo Lippi, and we were talking about definitions. And I would like to mention my father's definition about St. Augustine. He used to travel quite often to this beautiful city, but now he is 100 years old and he cannot travel anymore. But he used to say, St. Augustine is historic during the day and romantic at night. And we as citizens of this beautiful city, no matter how many changes we have, we should maintain our city historic during the day and romantic at night. Thank you.
Seems like a perfect ending for a really nice conference. Before you leave, I'd like to reiterate the thanks to Flagler College for hosting this, to the Florida Humanities Council, and a plug for them. If you guys are not a member of the Florida Humanities Council, I'm giving extra credit to my class. Please go on their website. Please join them. These are tough times for the humanities, and the projects and the things they do in local communities are unbelievably fantastic. And also to Susan Parker and the St. Augustine Historical Society, thank you so much.
Thank all of you for being here. It's really gratifying to put a lot of work into an event like this and have as many people turn out as they have. And I think probably the one thing that was said to me today that made all the work worthwhile came from Shirley Thompson when she said, "I'm so sorry this is going to be over."
Thank you.